We were on our way yesterday, Pat and I, to ICF, and we were listening to sports radio, and it was very interesting because the sports commentator was contrasting the style of two different teams. And he talked about one team, and he says, they play with a style of precise control, real precision, real methodical. Then he talked about the other team. And he says, this team, well, how can I describe it? I guess it's kind of a controlled chaos. Okay? And when my wife heard that, she laughed out loud because it was such a funny term, controlled chaos. And I laughed too, but I only laughed internally because lo and behold, that was what I had chosen for today's sermon title, Controlled Chaos. And we're going to see this in the 51 verses that we are going to go through. But you know, controlled chaos is not such an unusual event. You remember when Job was going through the problems in his life, you know, when his children were dying, when his fortunes were failing, when his health plummeted, and where he was even put under great strain with his wife. And he said, what's going on, Lord? And all of it was chaos around him, and he was feeling pretty put out, kind of upset with God. And yet, what's going on? Those of us today, we read the Bible, we find out in the very first chapter, there is a spiritual battle going on. And so his life and his story is part of a bigger picture of a cosmic battle between God and Satan. And he just came on to one particular major scene in which he took part. Now, I've heard this story, and I don't know how much you're going to get of this, but they say that when people do quilts, and back in the old days, ladies would get together and they would have a quilting circle, and they'd sit, and there would be a whole group of 6 or 8 or a dozen ladies, and they'd have this big piece of fabric, and they would quilt something together. And what would happen is if one of their little kids was crawling around and he crawled between the chairs and were to look up at the quilt from underneath, all they would see is a tangle of color and yarn and all kinds of stuff, and it would make no sense because they were looking at the quilt from the bottom. But if that child was to be pulled out from underneath the quilt, and the mom would hold the child up and point out the picture, the child would see something wonderful and beautiful. And so it's a matter of perspective. Underneath there is this chaos, but on top there is this picture, there is this story, there is this perhaps message that is going on. But not just when it's really terrible. You know, Josiah is very open about what's been going on. When we took him to the airport to go meet his fiancée, he was so happy. Like I said, he was like a kid going to Disneyland for the first time. And any of you ever work with the government like me? I never count my chickens before they hatch. Sure enough, he gets over there. And they're asking him for unreasonable things. And he writes back, he says, Pastor Ken, they're asking for this and that. I says, you know, Josiah, I think that what they're trying to do is they're trying to boondoggle you, meaning they're trying to get you to do a little greasing of the palm, right? And he says, well, you know, whatever happens, I know God is in control, and I'm just going to go with God's will. And so it goes from that one hiccup downhill. Pretty soon, everything is out of control. For a while there, it recovers a little bit, and he finally comes back, and instead of bringing his fiancée soon-to-be wife with him, to go through 2 weddings that have already been being in plans. It's all fallen apart. And now he has to wait to see what's going to happen. Then this week, early in the week, he calls me up. He says, Pastor, I got to tell you, I've got a blood clot in my leg. I says, Josiah, how did that happen? He says, I don't know. You know, you take these long flights, you want to get up and exercise a little bit because it often results in a blood clot just from sitting still for all that time. And so, you know, this could interfere with his going into his assigned training class with the Sheriff's Academy. And so he's going through this chaos. He's already been disappointed, and now he comes home, and he's recuperating with family, and he's getting replenished and everything. And then, boom, another thing hits. And, you know, even when we're going through good things, talking to one of the ICF couples yesterday, and I says, hey, how are plans coming along for the move? Thought you were already finished and moved into your new home. He says, no. Well, then when are you going to go? I don't know. I says, you don't know? We don't have any floors in our house. I says, oh, okay. What are you going to do with the other house? We don't know. We'll play it by ear. I go, wow, that doesn't sound real orderly. In fact, it sounds a little chaotic. It sounds like there's so many questions that are unanswered for this couple. And they're doing something wonderful. They're getting this new house. But I can foresee that even after they move in, there's going to be other issues that they're going to have to face. Life is like that. We're coming into what? Holiday season, right? We've already had Thanksgiving. Then we're going to have Christmas. Then we're going to have New Year. Then after that, if we're Chinese, we're going to have Chinese New Year. And yet all during that time, it's a time of controlled chaos. Kids are home disrupting your schedule. You got more things to take care of. No offense, kids, okay? That's just what happens. You're at work, right? You got to get all those things done for the end of the year. So that adds to your burden. If you got relatives coming in from out of town, you got to get the house specially ready for them, right? Or you might even have to take them around to different places, show them Disneyland, show them the Getty Museum, take them up to San Francisco or maybe all the way across country. And so it gets very chaotic. And it can be very, very stressful. Well, I think today's passage is about how it paid off for when Jesus went into the Garden of Gethsemane. And he prayed, and he prayed, and he prayed through until things were settled in his heart. And he comes out with a full confidence of God being in control. And as we said last night, this was always Jesus' pattern. Whenever he knew that there was a time of major decision-making, where there was a time of major transition into ministry, when there was a time when he was going to face special difficulties and trials, he would get away and he would pray hard and he would pray long until things got settled and his soul got centered and he felt comfortable and he was able to move the burden from his own shoulder and place it squarely on the shoulders of his heavenly Father. And so, these 51 verses shows how it paid off. Because what we're going to see is Jesus going through a period of great chaos. But through this chaos, Jesus is going to be totally in control. And his control is a big contrast to the lives that are around him going out of control. And we're going to see how wonderful it is to have that kind of control, to be able to live our lives without things getting us down, driving us crazy, and just making what should be good times bad or bad times worse. And so, let's begin. Let's look at Mark chapter 14. And I'm going to start at verse 41. We're going to go back a little bit to when he is still in the garden. And we're going to see how it picks up from there. Because as I say, I think this is tied to the time in the garden. All right, Mark 14, we're going to start at 41 and 42. And this is what it says. And he, meaning Jesus, came the third time, and he said to them, meaning Peter, James, and John, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It is enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." And so Jesus rises, full of strength, moving the action forward. He has a confidence in God that God's will be done as intended. He has prayed through from pain to peace in Gethsemane. He's wrestled with God the Father and has worked it out in his mind. And so in verse 43, now we transition into what happens during the arrest. And immediately, while he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12. You see how specifically he's pointed out? And with him, a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. This is the arresting posse, and they arrive like a mob. They're rushing out. They're thinking that they're going to put down an insurrection. They grab all kinds of weapons, not just the swords, but they're just grabbing clubs and whatever they can get. Verse 44, now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Seize him and lead him away under guard." And when he came, Judas, he went up to Jesus at once and said, "Rabbi," and he kissed him. And we see how treacherous it is, the way he acts. Jesus needs to be identified specifically. And as I'm reading this, I'm thinking, day after day he was in the temple. You guys came and you heard him. You guys came and you debated with him. You guys came and you tried to trap him. Where are all those people? Now, you have to depend on Judas. None of those people would come forward. And so they rely on Judas. And Judas, for his part, he uses the word rabbi, a word of honor. Okay? And then he gives him the traditional honoring kiss. This is the same Judas who during the meal, Jesus took the bread and he dipped it into the bowl and he got him some good morsels of food. And he gave it to him. You know, you go to eat in a Chinese setting, right? And we're taking from common food in the middle. And the person wants to honor you. What does he do? He gets the serving spoon and he gets the best piece. And he puts it not on his plate, but on your plate. And that's what Jesus has done for Judas. And Jesus is continuing to honor him and to appeal to him. And yet Judas will turn around and he will use these words of honor and he will use it to pinpoint Jesus, to ID Jesus for these mob. Verse 46, and they laid hands on him and seized him, but one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Who was this who grabbed the sword? Peter, right. One of the other gospel stories has it Peter. Now, what does Peter do in his profession? He's a fisherman, right? How good do you think he is with a sword? Not so hot, maybe. I don't know. No, you know, you get to the Greek, and you know what it says he got? He got the Guys, part of the ear. He only got a part of the ear. He missed. And Jesus says, stop, Peter, what are you doing? Put that away. And the Gospels say Jesus then took that ear and he restored it. And he took that neck and he made it whole again. And so in this chaos of the arrest, in this chaos of Peter getting out of control and pulling his sword, Jesus is the calm center. And he brings everybody to calmness. And he takes that ear and he heals it. And today we have a TV show that the kids love based on this passage. You know what that show is? What time did they come and arrest Jesus? At night. And how much of that ear was cut? Just the neck. And so what show do we have? Nick at Night. Yeah. Right? Okay. So moving on. All right. We'll move on. We won't stay on that any longer. But anyway, kidding aside, I find that often in my life, going through life, I find myself so thoughtless. Sometimes service personnel, I'm the paying customer, and I get a little bossy. I get a little thoughtless. I take them for granted. We do that with our family members too. And I realize a lot of times it's just like Peter. I'm causing all these little nicks in people's souls, in people's hearts, in people's day. You know what I mean? You say one little word and it hurts them. It disappoints them. They feel a little put down, a little belittled. And it's something that we can do unthinkingly. And it's part of the chaos of our own lives. Well, we see in verse 48, Jesus continuing to speak to them, and now he's taking control of the arrest. And Jesus said to them, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me, but let the scriptures be fulfilled. In other words, he was saying, yes, God, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. But he does, Jesus, call them out on their underhandedness. But he reminds himself, he reminds Peter and the apostles, he reminds these who have come that God's will is being done. Things are under control. Let's see what happens next. Verse 50. And they, meaning Jesus' followers, all left him and fled. And a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body. And they seized him. But he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. And most people think that this was Mark, young Mark as a teenager on the scene. And so you see more of this chaos that's going on, not only from the people in the mob, but also among Jesus' followers. And so everything is breaking loose everywhere. Verse 53, okay? We come now to Jesus' first trial. He's going to go through a series of actually 5 hearings, okay? 2 with the Jews, 3 with the Romans. So they led Jesus to the high priest. And all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes came together. And then it says, and Peter followed him at a distance right into the courtyard of the high priest. And he was sitting with the guards and warming himself at the fire. Okay? And so you remember from the past, Mark often puts various stories and he interpenetrates the stories together. And we're going to see what's happening. While on the inside, Jesus is undergoing trial, on the outside, who's undergoing an entirely different trial? Peter, yeah. So we're seeing two trials going on, just like we're going to see Peter and Judas as two betrayers of Jesus. And so anyway, Peter's presence is there, and he's over there warming. And I'm thinking about this guy, and I'm thinking, this is a fisherman. He's a tough guy. And he's worked in the dead of night, and, you know, he's been out there in the storms, in the damp weather, and this guy's cold. Some of you guys, you go fishing, 6 a.m., 4 a.m. It's cold, right? And 4 a.m. isn't even the coldest. It gets the coldest around 6 and 7. Well, anyway, have you ever been so scared? You go through such an adrenaline rush that as it passes, you find yourself shaking uncontrollably. You know, you're having an adrenaline crash. I've had those. And you're shaking, and it's not from cold. It's just something happening physiologically in your body. And I think that's what Peter's going through. And he's standing there, and he thinks he's going to warm himself up, and nothing is going to change because it has nothing to do with temperature. But while he's there, he's making himself very obvious. And what happens is this. While that first trial with the Jewish leaders were going on, something's going to happen to him. But we get to that. Verse 55, now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many bore false witness against him, and their testimony did not agree. Some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands. And yet even about this, their testimony did not agree. This, if I had been Jesus' defending attorney, is the time where I would ask for a directed verdict and end this whole thing. But it continues, verse 60. And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you? But he remained silent, and he made no answer. And remember, at the opening of this service, we read about how it predicted that Jesus would stay silent. He would make no answer, even as they led him like an animal to be slaughtered. Okay, verse 61b, the second half of that verse. Again, the high priest asked him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? Well, now the priest has identified him properly in the same almost exact words as when Peter finally identified him. And so Jesus, after all this time of denying his messiahship, or at least keeping it under wraps, not wanting it to be mentioned, he owns up to it. He knows that now is the time to let it be known very clearly. And so he breaks the silence, and he not only says, yes, this is who I am, but he quotes from the Old Testament, from Psalm 110 and Daniel 7, saying, not only that, but I am God. And so at this point, he takes over the trial. He's moving forward. It's moving toward a directed verdict where they're not able to convict him, but Jesus knows he needs to die. And so he gives them what they need, and he proclaims his deity. In verse 62, he amplifies and he says, and Jesus said, I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with clouds of heaven. And at this point, the high priest tore his garments and said, what further witnesses do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision? And they all condemned him as deserving death. Instead of receiving what Jesus said as part of the good news of their Messiah coming, they take it as a reason to execute him. Now we move to verse 65. And usually people put that with the part about the priests and the verdict. But I'm putting it with the next part about Peter, and you'll see why. It says, And some began to spit on him and to cover his face and to strike him, saying to him, "Prophesy." And the guards received him with blows. Things are getting really out of control here. And these are not the Romans, but these are still the Jewish temple guards at work. And so they're asking him to prophesy who's hitting him. But the legitimacy of Jesus as a prophet is now going to really become clear. Because what did he prophesy about Peter earlier? He's going to deny him. And sure enough, you see, when they're doing this kangaroo court and they're saying, show us that you're a prophet, he doesn't do anything. But now he's going to, for those who need to remember that he is indeed a prophet. And as Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came, and seeing Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, "You also were with the Nazarene Jesus." And he denies it, and she is very sure because she has heard his accent. And so verse 68, he denies it, saying, "I neither know nor understand what you mean." And he went out into the gateway, and the rooster crowed. There's a wake-up call for Peter. He should have run at this point, but he didn't. So verse 69, and the servant girl saw him and began again to say to the bystanders, "This man is one of them." And so, she's so proud that she heard his accent and figured it out. And so she's just bragging to the others about it. And Peter hears, and he's got to deny it again. It says in verse 70, and after a little while, the bystanders also again said to Peter, "Certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." Well, when you're caught in a lie, what do? You lie louder. So here's what he does. And he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, "I do not know this man of whom you speak." And immediately the rooster crowed a second time, and Peter remembered how Jesus had said to him, "Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And this guy who was already emotionally spent, this guy who was already shaking from fear, he breaks down and he weeps. Wow. He would have never in a million years expected that this would be him. The Bible warns in 1 Corinthians 10:12, "Let him who thinks he stand take heed lest he falls." I never take it for granted that I'm invulnerable. That as I turn the corner, Satan doesn't have the perfect trap for me. I never take it for granted. And, we dare not just coast along thinking, I've been in church for 30, 40 years. I can't mess up at this point. I'm too old. Well, guess what? King David messed up at the end of his life when he was an old man. And I am so glad that God recorded that just as a reminder that you never get to the point where you can't mess up. Never get to that pride. But you still keep yourself spiritually strong. You still keep yourself spiritually resilient. You still continue to input into your body spiritually. Chapter 15. Now the religious trial is over. He's gone to the high priest of the Jews and the high priest of the Romans, and now they send him over to Pilate because only the Romans can give official authorization for execution. And what happens starts in verse 1. And as soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and the scribes and the whole council, and they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." And the chief priests accused him of many things. And Pilate again asked him, "Have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you?" But Jesus made no answer, so Pilate was amazed. And if you read the other Gospels, what you find is that Pilate, who is in control of this area on behalf of the Romans, is helpless. He tries 3 times to get Jesus off the hook. And each time he is shouted down by the Jews. And he finally has one last card to play. He plays the Barabbas card. He says, listen, at the feast, usually I excuse one of you Jews as a goodwill gesture to you. Who do you want me to release? Starting at verse 6. Now at the feast, he, Pilate, used to release for them one prisoner for whom they asked, and among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. And the crowd came to him and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did, and he answered, saying, who do you want me to release? How about the king of the Jews? And then God uses a third-party observer to see what was going on. Verse 10, for he, Pilate, perceived that it was what? Out of envy, that the chief priests had delivered him up. Verse 11, but the chief priests stirred up the crowds to have him release for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate again said to them, then what shall I do with the man you call the king of the Jews? And they cried out, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, why? What evil has he done? You see, he has a clear notion that this is a kangaroo trial. And they shouted all the more, crucify him. And so Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. And so finally, it says in verse 16, the soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole battalion. Now we're talking about the Roman soldiers. And they clothed him in purple cloak, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on him, and they began to salute him, Hail, King of the Jews! And they were striking his head with a reed, and spitting on him, and kneeling down in homage to him. And then finally, and when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the royal purple cloak, and they put his own clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him. 3 things are precious for me. I never thought about it, but, you know, Barabbas was exchanged for Jesus. Jesus was exchanged for Barabbas, the guilty murderer and insurrectionist. This is put there to say Jesus didn't die just as a political thing, as a religious thing, as a persecution thing. He made a substitute of himself for a wrongdoer, for a sinner. You know, I am Barabbas. We are Barabbas. Jesus' death is in substitution for our sinfulness. And so this incident is not just something that happened, but it's a reminder to me that Christ died in my place, that I should have died in my own place. Second, we need to realize that sometimes we will betray Jesus. We will say, I will not fail you, and we will fail you. Sometimes I just cop out. I should be doing something for God, and I don't do it. Sometimes I won't do it for a long time. I'll dig in my heels. I just don't feel like it. I'd rather do my own thing. You know? And we disappoint him. And we deny him. We say no to him. But you know, just like Jesus said, I know what's going to happen. But after it's done, don't despair. Meet me in Galilee. and we're going to pick up on our mission, on our endeavor. And so we have another two people being contrasted. We have on the one hand Judas, who will not accept the forgiveness. And then we have Peter, who will accept the forgiveness. And so, even if I could mess up in old age, I have the assurance that God knew. And he still says, look, meet with me, and we'll pick up again where we left off, and we'll continue forward once more. And then finally, whether it's the ordinary chaos of our lives as we live our lives, whether they're good or bad, the best way to face it is ahead of time. Go to God. Get serious. Pray hard. Pray long. Pray until things are settled and you know that God's will is being done. And while we live on the underside of the quilt and all we can see is chaos, on the top side of the quilt, something beautiful is going on. God is in control, and he's moving our story forward with his story and his purpose. And he'll get us through it. And we look back and we see that those disappointments had a purpose. Those failures had a purpose. Those inadequacies, those betrayals, all those things had purpose. And there is hope and joy and victory on the other side. It's been chaotic, but Jesus was prepared. He had prayed long and hard in Gethsemane, and he continues to set the example for his apostles and for us, his disciples. Let's pray. Lord, too often we say in reply to a simple question, how are things? And we know that things are out of control, that our lives are chaotic, and we're not sure which way is up. But Lord, help us to know you are the one that is moving it purposefully forward. And we need to remind ourselves that your will is being done on earth as it is in heaven. And we just need to get on the schedule. We just need to get on with your agenda. We just need to move forward in step with you. So Lord, give us that kind of spiritual reminder so that in the midst of the chaos we can say, stop, and we can look to you. And we can find that your promise is a promise of peace that passes understanding. We can know that the plans that you have for us are not plans of confusion only, certainly not of destruction, but of a glorious hope and of a glorious future. So Lord, help us to not just doubt and wonder. Help us to turn to you. Thank you for being the God who is both the Alpha and Omega. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.